Hey everybody, Jerrod Sessler here. I want to do a quick video on the 17th Amendment. I actually went to a town hall and I spoke at it just this last weekend, and I mentioned the atrocity of the 17th Amendment, and there was a lot of people in the room that either didn't understand it or that were automatically against me because they believe in the Constitution. I'm going to tell you, the Constitution is amazing, but they have made some mistakes. The 16th, 17th, even the 18th Amendment, which was repealed with the 21st Amendment, are not good for America. And the 17th Amendment in particular is highlighted today because of the feckless nature and what we're actually seeing happening in the Senate right now. We currently have kings and queens in the Senate, which is the upper chamber of Congress, and that was never intended to be the case. In my book, How We Broke America, bestseller in 3 weeks, I talk about this in chapter 10 and chapter 11. The 16th and 17th Amendment are ways that we have broken America. They're bad for the country, and I'm going to explain why very briefly, but you can get a copy of How We Broke America on Amazon. I also want to mention one other book. A friend of mine, Matt Hawkins, wrote this book. It's called Counties First, and essentially what this book espouses and encourages, let me make sure you get a good view of that, is something called the Convention of Counties. We have a thing called the Convention of States that's in our Constitution. But when you really understand how that system works and how it's set up, you will also agree that we should have convention of counties. Okay, the 17th Amendment reads like this: the senators of the United States shall be composed of 2 senators from each state, elected by the people thereof for 6 years. Each senator will have 1 vote. This goes on to talk about some other things in terms of when vacancies happen and things like that. The point is that these words where it says elected by the people thereof, that's not the way senators were intended to be elected, and that's part of the reason why our country and our states have been weakened as a result. So let me explain. The United States Congress is made up of 2 separate houses or chambers, the upper chamber, the upper house, and the lower house, the lower chamber. It's not supposed to be degrading that there is an upper and a lower, like one is above the other. It actually has to do with the lower chamber or the lower house is from the British House of Commons, and the House of Commons is the commoner. So the lower chamber or the House, which has more people in it, has 435 people in it, is of the people. It's the people's house. They are elected directly of the people and by the people. The upper chamber, which is the Senate, has longer terms and is elected by state legislatures, and it has more of a professional feel to it. It has higher responsibilities, like, for example, confirming the president's choices and even being responsible for signing treaties and also convicting in the case of impeachment. So the House would vote for impeachment, but then the Senate would have to approve that or convict. But the main point of it is that we have an upper house and a lower house, and they each have different responsibilities, each elected by different entities. So let me just talk about why that's important. So originally, the senators were appointed by the state legislatures, and there's a number of reasons why it should be that way. For example, let's talk about the flow of money. We know that in Congress, the lower house or the people's house, the commoners, are responsible for the purse strings of the country. So when they approve spending, originally prior, and this is where the 16th Amendment kind of ties in, and the Federal Reserve, both of which were passed in 1913. I believe the 16th Amendment was in February of 1913, and then December that year they passed the Federal Reserve Act. And so what that gave the federal government the ability to do was to tax the people directly. Prior to that, the only source of income that the federal government had was either from the states or it was through tariffs. Or there was some taxation, but it had to be passed and it was always temporary, like to pay for a war or something like that. So the point is this: if the House passes a spending bill, the money has to come from somewhere, right? Well, the assumption is from the founding of the country that that money was going to come from the taxpayers. That means that it would have to come through the state legislatures. Well, your state legislatures are obviously from each of the states, and on a federal level, the representation for the sovereign states is 2 senators. They are not there to represent the people of the state. That is the job of the House or the lower chamber. The job of the upper chamber or the Senate is to represent the sovereign, to represent the state, and they're appointed by people that are in the state legislature. So the lower house passes a spending bill and they send it to the Senate for approval. Originally, what would happen is the senators that come from their states, they would get direction. They would act as proxies for their Senate, for their state legislature. So if their state legislature approves or disapproves a bill, that's how they vote. They're similar to electors in a presidential election. They're proxies for the state legislatures. Now, there's a bunch of reasons why that's very important to understand that and for that process to be in place. But the 17th Amendment breaks it. And what happens now is, earlier I mentioned we have kings and queens in the Senate, and they have massive staffs. It's very hard to even get near them or to talk to them or anything like that. And the biggest thing that is broken is they have almost no communication and they have no submission to their state legislatures, which is exactly the entity with which they are there to represent. The state legislature is the representation of the states. We are promised a representative government, and the system has been broken as a result of the 17th Amendment. Now, there's a bunch of reasons why the 17th Amendment was enacted and was passed. One of them has to do with corruption. No surprise. We always have this issue with corruption in politics, but there were issues around people getting paid off or bought off, and different things happening in order to get people selected to be able to be the senators from their particular states. I understand that, but the issue is that making the senators be elected by popular vote is not the right answer. It was a huge mistake for the country. One of the things that's very important to understand is that our federal government was enacted and put together in part and primarily, if you read the Declaration of Independence, to make sure that our country was safe and secure, to make sure that the people were safe. And so the states and the state legislatures maintained the majority amount of the power. If you read the 10th Amendment in the Constitution, it's very clear that the federal government and federal Congress, their power is limited to what's clearly articulated within our Constitution. Well, the federal Constitution you can read in just a few minutes. It's a very small document. Obviously, we've gone way beyond that. So the government should have offices. They could possibly have some land for national parks. Obviously, they're going to have a military because we want to have a unified federal military to make sure that we're safe from outside forces. The Civil War teaches us that part of the responsibility for the federal government is to maintain unity among the states, to make sure that states aren't trying to secede from the nation, and to make sure that there isn't conflict between the states. That's the role of the federal government. It doesn't go much beyond that legally in terms of actually reading the Constitution. Another thing that this would change and have a huge effect on is lobbying. If we did not have the 17th Amendment, there would be no reason for lobbyists to visit or to support or to fund senators, because the senators are voting based on their state legislatures. I suppose the lobbyists could go to the state legislatures and try to affect them, but the votes and the decisions for these votes ultimately should be coming from the state legislatures, not from the senators. So there's no reason to have lobbying in the Senate other than as a result of and because of the 17th Amendment. Another point that is really important to understand, and it's a bit insidious and maybe not completely obvious, is the 17th Amendment really weakens the state legislatures. It takes power from the states and it puts it in D.C. where we do not want it. We want to decentralize out of D.C. and we want to deregulate this country. We certainly don't want to give more power to them. And abolishing the 17th Amendment would be a huge step in the right direction. Let me explain why. At home, most people that I talk to are not aware of what legislative district that they're in. They don't know who their representatives are in their state capital, either senators or representatives. We have a similar structure in the states where you elect locally, you elect people to go to your state capital, similar to electing representatives and senators that go to the federal government. The reason why a lot of people don't know who their representatives are in their states, in part, is because they don't get to choose who their senators are. Because senators on a federal level are elected using popular vote, the people that represent on the state level are not as powerful. Now, think about it this way. If you knew that the person that you were going to elect locally was going to make a decision for who went to DC as your senators, then you would be much more in tune with making sure that you knew who you were sending to your state capital. So that brings power back to the states, which is exactly what we want. I mentioned it earlier, but the senators on a federal level have no deference for their state legislatures, which is totally wrong. They are there not to represent the citizens or the people. They're there to represent the sovereign states. They should be in communication with the state legislatures on a regular basis, and they're not. Another thing that we can look at is there's a lot of discussion around apportionment lately, which is basically determining how many representatives a state gets. It's based on population. Again, another obvious point of clarity, the House or the lower chamber in Congress is elected by the people, and that is determined by apportionment. The number of representatives that you get for the House is determined by the number of people that live in the state. The senators are not determined that way. Each state, regardless of their population, gets 2 senators. It doesn't matter. A state like Wyoming and Alaska and 3 other states, I think there's 5 or 6 total, only have 1 representative in the House, but they have 2 senators because their population is at or below around 1 million people. Well, there's about 750 to 800,000 people per legislative or per congressional district, and that's how many people you need to have in order to send another representative. If your state increases in population, then you would take a representative from another state where those people are coming from, and you would get another representative in your state. My point with that whole thing is, again, it points to this structure that the senators are not representing the people specifically, they're representing the sovereign states. And they need to be connected with their state legislatures, and that's the way it works. And so the apportionment doesn't apply to Senate. So in closing, the early 1900s so-called progressive era was a disaster for the country. The 16th Amendment is the amendment that gave the Congress the ability to tax us directly. That same year, in 1913, they passed the Federal Reserve Act, which means when they can't tax us with enough money, but they want to spend more, then they can just go borrow it. The 17th Amendment was also passed that year, which changed the way the senators were elected. It's ironic because, again, you talk about the flow of money. The House is supposed to approve the spending, but then it has to go through the Senate. The Senate is supposed to get signal from the state legislatures in order to approve that spending. Lo and behold, they passed the 17th Amendment so they can bypass the state legislatures altogether and spend as much money as they want to. And of course, not long after, they passed the 18th Amendment, which was prohibition, which was their attempt to legislate morality, which will never work, and that ended up getting overturned 13 years later with the 21st Amendment. So we have to, at some point, we have to realize that the 16th and 17th Amendment were very detrimental to our country, and we either have to repeal them or we have to change our structure to make sure that we remove the negative effects of those.